Last week, the Purdue Pharma bankruptcy trial began. If the proposed settlement is approved, the Sackler family, who own the company, would be released from any future opioid-related claims. Meanwhile, Purdue Pharma is reportedly relying on high-end lobbying firms. In the past year and a half, they spent over $1.2 million on lobbying expenses. Joining us now to discuss is White House reporter for Real Clear Politics, Philip Wegman. Welcome, Philip.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, the main firm on the receiving end of this business is Brownstein Hyatt, which is also one of the firms that's stuck by Saudi Arabia post Jamal Khashoggi dismemberment. Does Brownstein feel like there are no clients that can damage their reputation in Washington? Are they just trying to become like some sort of Death Star of lobbying?
Well, look, lobbyists have to send their kids to private schools. They have to send their families to the best vacations. They've got to pay the mortgage too. So can you really blame these lobbyists for just trying to make a living off of sort of the worst things that are happening in the news right now?
Well, when you put it like that, yeah.
It's kind of tongue in cheek, but look, what is happening right now, the story that you just referenced, is horrifying, but it is not surprising. The reason why is you have a company that is seeking protections in court, and at the same time, they are trying to protect themselves in the future by lobbying against legislation that would really hold them accountable. The reason this isn't surprising is that, sadly, this is often how Washington works. You hire protection from these lobbyists who can buddy up to members of Congress who can say, well, actually, don't listen to your constituents who are telling you these horror stories from the opioid epidemic. Look at this. And oh, by the way, we're going to be ready to, get involved in the upcoming midterms, right? This is how influence peddling works in Washington, D.C. And sadly, if it wasn't for the reporting that you just referenced, I think that this would have flown underneath the radar because this type of stuff is so common, despite the industry that we're taking a look at.
Well, and Phil, I think the worst part of this reporting is the fact that if this deal is in fact reached, victims of the opioid crisis who were hurt by Purdue Pharma's misconduct will not be able to seek legal recourse and essentially sue. I don't know that there's a good answer for individuals in the future, but is there anything on a policy level that could be done differently? Like you may recall in Congress several years ago when we were dealing with one pharmaceutical company that was jacking up the prices of HIV and AIDS therapeutics, and he was hauled before Congress and the Oversight Committee to testify on it. But is there any path for recourse for victims of this?
This isn't a new problem, like you just mentioned. I mean, it's easy for Congress to bring a bad actor in front of committee to wag their finger at him to get the clips that they need for their local news or for a campaign ad, but then to avoid doing the actual heavy lifting. What I'm afraid of right now is that there was significant progress that was made when it came to the opioid epidemic. You had the public taking a close look at what was actually happening in the Midwest and in areas that often get overlooked. But we just went into a pandemic. And so for the last year and a half, you've had a lot of people who were already up against the wall. There was a lot of pain and suffering, and addiction got worse, not better. I think that if the Sackler family is allowed to skate in court, and then also pharma is allowed to protect themselves from future liabilities through their lobbying efforts, it's going to be incredibly discouraging. But frankly, that seems like the likely outcome right now.
Yeah. So one of the things that's in this reporting is that these lobbyists they claim that they weren't actually lobbying. Is that right? They were claiming that they were monitoring. What does that even mean?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, there's a couple of different ways to skin the cat. You have lobbyists who don't register as lobbyists because they're just consultants. You have people who are monitoring legislation and they're not actually, really lobbying on it. They're just calling some offices to get a better idea of what's going on. I think that, regardless of the semantics, this is a powerful lobbying firm on K Street. They know what they're doing. And if they actually needed to, turn things to full lobbying mode, they certainly would. I'm not interested in the semantics, and I feel bad for whatever Flack had to craft that statement because it's a joke, and this isn't one of these things where we don't know the destruction that has happened to a lot of these families. It's not like we haven't seen the stories of that single mom who was working 2 jobs, who got hurt and then took what the doctor prescribed her, got hooked on it. It's not like we haven't seen the stories about the high school football player who got hurt through regular injury and then got hooked on it. I mean, we know what this stuff does. We know that it needs to be dealt with very carefully. And the thing is, this is just the tip of the iceberg. You had these pharmaceutical companies through different pain advocacy groups going around telling Congress, no, we don't want more regulation. This is actually needed. And they knew what was happening. So shame on them. And I really don't care for their statement at this point.
The proposed settlement was announced in October of last year. It has since been modified to slightly increase the cash settlement. If approved, the Sacklers will make a contribution of $4.28 billion, which still leaves them with $6 billion in total assets. That's $6 billion with a B. That money would be untouchable by victims of the opioid epidemic. And on top of that, Philip, they would not go to prison. The Intercept article mentions one mother's son who, in the grips of the substance abuse disorder, ended up serving 10 months for, I think, stealing a few things from a Walmart. So, so you're going to have, probably, hundreds of thousands of people who do small amounts of jail time for petty crime related to their addiction. While you're going to see the Sackler family, not just walk away with $6 billion, but also not face any prison time. Do you think that they're going to be able to get away with this, or do you think eventually the screw will tighten enough that there will be so much public demand that they actually will go before a criminal jury?
Well, look, pharmaceutical companies have done fantastic, miraculous things. I think that the last couple months of close to normalcy is a perfect example of that with these vaccines that were developed so quickly. The public is ready to say, yes, pharmaceutical company, please, make some profit off of this vaccine that makes my life better. But the public at this point is also not very particularly happy when they see a miscarriage of justice like that, because in the back of their mind, they're not going to be thinking about, all of the legal particulars. They're not going to be thinking like, is this the, correct use of bankruptcy law? They're going to be thinking about that story from someone they know in their town. And what they've realized is that, their friend who either lost their life, or their friend who is still in the grips of addiction, or their friend who has run into legal trouble, they don't have a high-powered lawyer, and let alone a high-powered lobbyist. So certainly one would hope that the justice would be on the way, and that perhaps we'd see more teeth to these legal cases. But money talks, and these guys have lawyers and lobbyists, and they don't seem particularly concerned.
Yeah, and one of the most incredible things about this is the way that they powered through kind of what I think of as sort of the American grift cycle, which is that these grifters spot an area to profit, they go for it, they create all sorts of destruction and misery in their wake. It gets covered in books and documentaries. There's some federal investigations are launched, and the grifters move on to the next grift cycle. But that cycle, was nearing its completion at the end of the 2000s, and the Sacklers said no. We're going to plow right through this cycle. They after the books were written, after the Pulitzers were dished out for these investigations, they kept up the exact same behavior, apparently well aware of the fact that there wouldn't be any actual real consequences, and they're still going to go to their graves in a soft fashion with more money than they or their descendants could ever spend.
Well, and just one last point I think Phil made an important one, which if the pandemic's taught us anything, it's that the pharmaceutical industry can do good. It's one of the most innovative, important, and life-saving industries in our country, but it is these horrific actors like the Sacklers, like the case I mentioned of HIV and AIDS therapeutics being misused just for profit, that ends up hurting the whole industry and the perception within the country of what big pharma is. So, I think we can all agree that some heads need to roll here. It doesn't look like they're going to. If I were advising them, I'd say, maybe donate at least $1 billion of your many billions to victims of the opioid epidemic, because it is an American tragedy. Phil, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And I'd tell them to flee the country because we're not done with them.
They belong in jail.
Yes. And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.